Hello and welcome to the ISIS tutorial. This is the first episode and we will talk about the basics of ISIS and learn how to use variables. As you may know or not know, ISIS is based on slang, and slang is a multi-platform programmer's library which also has a versatile interpreter. In this first few tutorials, we will almost exclusively use features of slang and not of ISIS, as you can think of ISIS as just the spectral fitting add-on to slang. However, I will not distinguish between ISIS and slang, as it is of almost no practical consequence in everyday use. So I will always say ISIS, when actually many of the commands we use in the first few tutorials will also work in slang. I assume you have HereSoft and ISIS installed and everything is set up and running. If that is not the case, you can find instructions how to install the software online, for example here and here. If everything is set up correctly, you can just go ahead to your terminal and type ISIS, return, and ISIS should start up. As you can see, you get a little bit of information about ISIS when it starts, among them the ISIS version number. Here I'm using version 1.6.2-27. And then the ISIS prompt comes up saying ISIS and a little triangle and a cursor. And you're ready to go. You can start typing, you can use ISIS, do your analysis or whatever. We will start with the most simple thing in ISIS, and that's defining variables. Variables can have different types, like integer or double or string, and we will go through them in this tutorial. But for now, let's just start with a simple integer. Type the variable name, let's call it a, the equal sign, and the value you want to assign to that variable, let's say 3. Very important, at the end of each command, ISIS requires a semicolon. A command is not finished in ISIS before you type the semicolon. Just hitting return will do nothing. Okay, we have everything now. Let's hit return and boom, we have our variable defined. But because the semicolon ends the command and not the return key, we can have more than one command in one line as long as we separate them with a semicolon. For example, we can say B equals 5, C equals 6. And this works. These are two separate commands defining the variables B and C. And as you already can see in the last line, it does not really matter where you put spaces. ISIS itself does not care about spaces. So you can also say D space 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 equals space 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 8 space 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 semicolon. The semicolon is really important, but the spaces are not. You can place them wherever you want or leave them out completely. Now that we have defined a couple of variables, how do we get the value of each variable printed to the screen? Well, the easiest is just to type the variable name a followed by a semicolon, return, and aha, a is 3. What happens internally actually is that when you write a semicolon return, a is put on the stack. But in the interactive mode of ISIS, this stack is immediately emptied as soon as you hit return and printed out on the screen. So this sounds maybe a bit technical, and it probably is, but you don't have to be concerned about it just now. We will cover the stack in more detail in another tutorial. For now, just remember that you can get the value of the variable easily put out on the screen by just typing the variable name followed by a semicolon. Okay, let's have a look at the operations that we have available with variables. We can of course do math with them. We can add, subtract, multiply, and divide variables. Let's do that and do it all in one line. Let's define a new variable called rsum, which is the sum of a plus b, a variable called rdiff, which is the difference between c and d, rmult, which is the product of a and b, and rq, which is calculated by dividing c by d. And all these variables are defined now, and we can check their value. So let's look at rsum. Our sum is 8, No surprise there. Let's look at our diff and our mult at the same time. Whoa, what happened there? Our diff is 15 and our mult is -2. That doesn't make sense. No, so actually our diff is -2 and our mult is 15. And the problem is, or the point is, that ISIS uses a stack and that the stack is LIFO. Last in, first out. So we put in our mult on the stack after our diff, so our mult is on top of the stack and therefore comes out first. That's why 15 is printed out before -2. So you have to be careful with these things, and it might be just easier to do it one by one. Just say our diff, that's -2, our mult, that's 15, all makes sense. Wonderful. So now what is the value of our q, our division of two variables? Let's have a look. Our q is 0. Why is that? Well, I guess you know the answer. We are using integer variables, and integer means that there are no fractional numbers. So if I divide 6 by 8, I get out 0. To prevent that, at least one of the variables in our operation has to be float or double type. And we can easily declare a variable as double by writing d equals 8 dot for the decimal point, semicolon, or if you want to be more precise, e equals 8.0, semicolon. Don't forget the semicolon. I will repeat that over and over again. Okay, so let's define our q again, saying c divided by d, and then have a look at our q, and that's 0.75. That's what we expected. Great. Before you make a division or any other variable where you can get fractional numbers out, be sure that you have the right type of variables you're operating on. If you're not sure what your original variables are, if you don't know if they're integers or floats, then you can typecast them during the operation to double. And to do that, you just multiply them by 1 dot. So RQ2 equals 1 dot times A divided by B, semicolon. And that typecasts our whole operation to double type. Let's have a look at RQ2, and that's 0.6, it's a double. But be careful with that, because there are pitfalls. For example, you can do that. RQ3 equals 1 dot for double type times, and then we open parentheses, A divided by B plus B divided by C. Then we close the parentheses, put a semicolon, and hit return. Now RQ3 is 0. It's double precision, but it's still 0. And that's because the division operations themselves within the parentheses have been carried out before the implicit typecast to double, and therefore both led to 0, because they are integer divisions. So be careful about that. If you want to do it the other way around, going back from a double to an integer, you can use the int function. Let's say x equals int, and then open parentheses, 4.3 to have a double variable, close the parentheses, and don't forget the semicolon, return, and you can see x is now an integer and it's 4. Okay, what happens if we define another one? Let's say y equals integer 5.8. Why? Oh, y is 5. Okay, so you see the integer function doesn't do any rounding for you. It just truncates the value before the decimal point. So it will not do a correct rounding. To do a correct rounding, you need another function, and the function is called, yes, you guessed it, round. So define y again, y equals round of 5.8. Then we typecast this to integer, and we can just overwrite the old y. And then we look at y, and now it's 6. Wonderful. So if you want to be clever, you can do that all in one step. Y equals integer of round of 5.8, and then close all the parentheses and hit the semicolon. And then y is again 6. And this works because of the stacked nature of ISIS. The round function returns a value and writes it on the stack, and then the integer function immediately takes it from the stack and typecasts it to integer, and then returns another value, which is stored in the variable named y, which is the integer value of the correctly rounded 5.8. Okay, so we covered integers and doubles, and I pointed out that you have to be careful when operating with integers. Integers themselves have some value, like for indexing arrays, which we will see in the next tutorial. So slang and ISIS support all types of C variables, like integers and longs and unsigned integers and doubles and so on. But right now, we only need to concern ourselves with one more type of variable, and that's the string type. Strings are also very easy to find. Let's just have the variable name s equals, and then in quotation marks, whatever you want your string to be, let's say ASDF, and then end quotation marks, semicolon. And then look at s, and yes, s has the value ASDF. A string can basically be any combination of numbers or character. So we could also say s equals 45, and then s is the string 45. Or you can really do anything you want. Let's say s equals slash plus larger equals close parentheses space times percent 4 close the quotation marks semicolon, and look at s, and you have this super weird string defined. So what can we do with strings? For this tutorial, it will be enough to say that we can add or concatenate strings simply by putting a plus sign in between. So let's define sadd equals s plus a new string we just make up, let's say ASDF again. Semicolon, and then look at sadd, and yes, it's the combination of these two strings without any space between them. Other operations are not so easy on strings, and you need special functions for that. I mean, multiplying strings doesn't make sense anyway, but shortening strings or cutting strings or something like that, there are a lot of functions in ISIS that can do that for you, and we will cover them in a different tutorial. Also be aware that you cannot combine strings and numbers, either integers or double. So s plus 5 results in an error. Well, I guess that just makes sense, because what would you expect ISIS to do? Even if we define s as 45 again, we cannot do s plus 5, because s is a string type and not the integer number 45. One last point, ISIS has a command history, and the easiest way to access this is using the up arrow on your keyboard. So if you press it continuously, you can just go through all your old commands up to the basically first command you ever typed. This is very useful when you have like a very long or big command in the beginning. You can also use the left and right arrows to go through the command line and then delete single characters and type new ones. Or you can jump around in any command by using Ctrl A to jump to the first character or to the beginning of the line, and Ctrl E to jump to the end of the line. There is, of course, a manual for ISIS and slang, and you can find that here. It has much more detail than we can cover in this tutorial, so if you feel like you want to read something, read up on something, then download the manual and have it always handy. Well, that's about all for this tutorial. We have learned how to define variables, how to typecast them, and discuss the three most important types of variables: integers, doubles, and strings. In the next tutorial, we will have a look at the more complex types of variables, like arrays. Thanks for listening.